C'est un plaisir d'accueillir mon collègue Sam White. Je vais le présenter en anglais. Il va parler en anglais. Pas lentement, je pense. Okay, he is professor of the Faculty of Social Science at the University of Helsinki. He is a historian by training, like me, and someone who's at work I have admired and envied for many years. He is the author of two really major monographs in the field of the history of climate and society, two remarkable books that tackle two very different parts of the world, The Climate of Rebellion in the Early Modern Empire in 2011, and A Cold Welcome, The Little Ice Age and Europe's Encounter with North America in 2017. I also will point out that he was one of the co-editors of the Palgrave Handbook of Climate History. And personally, I normally hate handbooks, companions, guides, all of these things. This one is the exception that makes them all worthwhile. It is, for me, a constant reference and a really valuable and original contribution to climate history. If you're looking for one kind of encyclopedic version of what we know about paleoclimatology and its impact on human societies in the past, the Palgrave Handbook of Climate History is an essential reference. So beyond being a brave and pioneering scholar, he's also someone I admire as a catalyst, an organizer in the field, a great colleague to many scholars who are seeking to work in this area, someone who enables others to pursue their work as well. So he's a great collaborator, and it's a real pleasure to have him with us here. Please join me in welcoming him to the Collège de France.
Je vais continuer dans un instant en anglais, mais tout d'abord, je voudrais remercier mon collègue, professeur Harper, de m'avoir invité. Et merci à vous tous d'être venus aujourd'hui. Je suis très heureux de présenter ce nouveau projet. Comme vous le voyez, il y a une bonne vingtaine de collaborateurs dans le projet. Donc, il va de soi que toutes les meilleures idées sont les leurs et toutes les fautes sont les miennes. And with that caveat, I will go ahead and continue. I apologize. Let me see if I can adjust this so the microphone is more consistent. Okay, it seems to be working now. So, conflict is not necessarily the most direct, the most immediate, the most consistent companion to climatic change, especially when we might compare it to disasters such as recurrent heat waves or devastating droughts or problems with food supply. Nevertheless, conflict features largely in the imagination and our fears of climate change in the coming century. When we think about the worst existential risks of climate change, they often turn on our fears that a warming world, will lead to more conflict. If we can cooperate, after all, we may come to solve our problems. But when we think about the greatest risks, the greatest catastrophes that might come, they come from our divisions. They come from the prospect of more war and violence. Moreover, many of our worst conflict zones in the world are also zones most affected by climatic change. These would include, for instance, the Sahel and the Middle East. And certainly, climate change is already figuring more and more into security planning and into defense spending and defense scenarios for the 21st century. Now, in terms of the study of climate and conflict, there have been two largely separate approaches, I would say. One are approaches within the historical sciences, the ways in which climate and conflict have been analyzed occasionally in history, historical geography, archaeology, and in the broader field sometimes known as historical climatology, referring to diverse ways in which we try to use historical records to understand past climatic variations, extreme weather, and their human consequences. Even within the field of historical sciences, there have been often divergent quantitative and qualitative approaches, which I will discuss more in the lecture. Now, this historical field has looked largely at history for history's sake, we might say. I've presented a couple of examples here. Of course, the more important work of my former colleague at Ohio State University, Jeffrey Parker, his grand synthesis, The Global Crisis, on climate and conflict in the 17th century, as well as my more modest contribution on the Ottoman Empire in the late 16th and 17th centuries. Now, certainly when I was doing my own research, my primary concern was to understand a 17th century crisis and conflict in its own terms, and hoped perhaps from that we might draw some lessons from the past. Now, in thinking about this historical literature more broadly, we might say that its advantage is that it's very long on perspective. It can take a long view of events, look across many centuries and many countries, but does so often with the limited data available to historians. On the other hand, there is a body of contemporary literature on this, contemporary approaches. These have been looking at current developments in climate change and conflict, as well as potential projections of climate to come and scenarios for how those conflicts may evolve. Here, too, there are different quantitative and qualitative approaches, largely within the social sciences, some looking at broad statistical associations, others at particular case studies. And here, the emphasis has been mostly on policy relevance first, and to some extent also on improving the methodology within the field to better understand in the future how climate and conflicts might be related. Here we might say the strength is that the data are quite rich. We have modern census data, we have, in some cases, very precise data of population displacements based on information such as cell phone records, remote sensing from satellites. However, the weakness of this may be that its perspective is much shorter. It looks at a contemporary phenomenon as it is evolving, without necessarily the deeper views that come from the past. So, last summer, at a workshop in Oslo, many colleagues and I tried to come up with a way to bridge these past and present perspectives. And in doing so, to try to answer some fundamental questions for our research. For instance, are historical analogues of climate and conflict useful in our approaches to the challenges of global warming, or are they potentially misleading? Do we see more long-term patterns that develop between climates in conflict, between past and present, or more discontinuities? Are we facing different types of challenges in the present? And by taking a longer-term perspective, can we build more realistic scenarios for the future? Can we better imagine the kinds of challenges we must prepare for in the next generations? Now, I will start here by trying to present in large terms what some of the quantitative historical and qualitative historical research looks like, before seeing how we can bring that in dialogue with our contemporary concerns and our contemporary research. Now, the principal insight that has come from quantitative historical research has been the finding of large-scale linear associations between climatic change and increasing frequency of warfare, as in the work, for instance, of David Zhang and others and colleagues in Hong Kong. In other words, it was found, with research starting around 15 years ago, that if you were to take a large-scale view of, say, changing temperature trends in early modern Europe or early modern China, where we have some of the most historical records, you would see that these broadly correlate, or you could draw a linear model that shows broad correlations between this temperature trend and a rising frequency of warfare as identified in certain historical databases. It was assumed that this effect was mediated through climate's impacts on prices, particularly food prices, as well as on population. That is to say, in cases where population had been rising, the risk of conflict was worse, but if conflict and related catastrophe brings the population down, it would reduce the impact of climate on prices, potentially mediating the impact on conflict frequency. This was found to be particularly the case during so-called Little Ice Age cooling, phases of particular cooling, which I believe my colleague will discuss later in a forthcoming lecture, in Europe and China, where we have the most data. Now, this research was quite high impact when it came out and is still often cited, but it has received some criticisms as well in the years since. The data sets that were used in early studies were often limited, and not just limited in the sense that they did not provide detailed information, but that there may be particular biases in the kind of information. Here, I've included a simplified example here to show what may go wrong occasionally in the historical data. When we are looking for evidence of causation based on statistical correlations, what we are doing is making an assumption that climatic change or an extreme event will lead to some impact, and that both the climatic change or extreme event and the impact will independently of each other be reported in sources. But if there is also a bias towards reporting disasters and reporting climatic extremes when there is an impact, as indicated by the dashed arrow here, it would throw off our statistical associations. Moreover, in the effort to overcome some of the limits of these data sets, there was a tendency to look at very large scales over, say, the whole of imperial China or the whole of Central Europe, and to imagine the effects taking place decade to decade rather than, say, year to year. This may not have been the most appropriate scale of units or time duration to look at, however, given that it may be the case, as examined in other historical conflicts in qualitative studies, that these effects are often more abrupt and more local. The historical processes imagined may have been excessively simplified, which may have made the effects appear to be more direct and stronger than they are. And finally, the statistical approaches used may have introduced so-called artifacts. The most powerful of these is what is known as autocorrelation. To explain in very simple terms, what this means is that both climatic change and conflict frequency in many of these data sets often correlated each year to what had gone on the year before, or each decade to what had gone on the decade before. This is understandable if, first of all, you consider how the initiation of some conflict, such as, say, the beginnings of the 30 Years' War in Europe, or the beginnings of the fall of the Ming Dynasty in China, would often spiral into multiple conflicts over the following years, creating a seemingly upward trend in conflict numbers. And if you were to look at climate change as averaged out over decades, it may be that certain distinct extreme events begin to look too like larger trends towards cooling or greater drought. And if you set those two trends next to each other, it can give the impression of a stronger statistical correlation than is actually the case. Since these criticisms, which I think were particularly strong in work, say, 5 years ago or so, there has been an ongoing search to find better historical data and statistical methods, which I will return to in a moment. But first, I want to discuss a bit of the historical qualitative research as well. And here I'll distinguish qualitative from quantitative by saying that in quantitative research, the search for causation will be based on a statistical relationship between a climate variable and a frequency or degree of conflict, whereas in qualitative research, we are often starting from a known event and looking back through the historical record at the particular steps by which we arrived there and the necessary conditions for its occurrence. Now, this qualitative research has generally focused on detailed case studies of climate and of conflict, crisis very often, and in some cases, the contrary, of adaptation or resilience. It is focused largely on identifying specific causal pathways by which climate and conflict may have been connected. To simplify a great deal in my research on the Ottoman Empire, I started from known data on climate and knowing that there was a large rebellion known as the Celali Rebellion at the end of the 16th century in the Ottoman Empire. And I was able to find that there was a specific way in which they were related. Namely, that Ottoman tax and provisioning systems had become increasingly stressed during times of conflict, during times of warfare in the 16th century. During a period of exceptional cooling and drought in the 1590s, there was a series of terrible harvests, reducing the Ottoman Empire's ability to extract resources from the provinces. And there was also a widespread disease among sheep and cattle, probably an outbreak of rinderpest. And it was specifically demands for requisitioning sheep that triggered this rebellion, and this was evident in the sources. So in any case, we can find sometimes these very specific historical causal pathways. And along with these, the possibilities for historical contingency, for accident, for human decisions, for agency, as well as other mediating social and historical factors. But there are potential criticisms for this qualitative research as well. Given that we are starting from known outcomes, how representative are the stories we are telling of larger connections between climate and conflict? Do more stories mean that do more stories of conflict mean that there is a stronger connection? Do more stories of resilience mean that there are a weaker connection? It's hard to know until we know how representative these are and how indicative each story is of broader patterns. And in particular, whether these patterns persist into the present so that we know whether they are still relevant. So here, I think the search is on now for more robust patterns that we can find within historical case studies, their relationship to the present, and stronger theoretical frameworks we might borrow from contemporary social sciences. So this brought us then to this desire to bring our historical work together with current perspectives. With the quantitative precision available, with the great deal of extra data that is available in contemporary studies, we could start to ask ourselves, what do climate conflict links actually look like in our rich contemporary data? And could we then identify similar links or not in the historical data? And when it comes to this question of robust patterns, of causal pathways, we could ask ourselves, are there recurring patterns now in how climate is driving conflict? And do these look broadly similar to, analogous to, those we find in history, or are they something fundamentally different? So this brought us to then some of the major developments, the major findings in contemporary peace and conflict research. Here, I would summarize what is now a very large field, by saying that there has been, that there was an attempt early on, I should say, to find more direct and more global associations between climate change and the frequency of conflict. However, these connections were often surprisingly weak in terms of the strength of connections in linear models, and they were often disputed. This played out in particular in high-profile disputes between work by Saul Sheng and colleagues and Norman Buhag and colleagues, starting around 10 years or so ago. But since then, the research has largely shifted from simply whether climate causes more conflict to more complex questions, perhaps, as to where, when, and how. To say that there is not a strong linear global relationship between climate change and conflict frequency is not to say that climate change is not influencing conflict in many ways. When it occurs, how it occurs, whether it occurs in a particular country or not, whether it occurs in a particular year or not, or how difficult the conditions are, how great the impacts are. So in other words, we have moved on in the research from looking not only or even at whether there is more conflict in a warming world, but to the different kinds of conflicts that may be associated with the challenges, with the impacts of global warming, and the new security problems that these will bring. In particular, the research on contemporary effects seems to show two kinds of patterns. One of these is that the effects are often indirect, delayed, and displaced when we look at them in quantitative terms. The reasons for this can be roughly illustrated through this diagram, namely that an initial climate event may have some direct impacts on conflict. It may be, for instance, that food prices go up and there are riots over rising prices or availability of basic foodstuffs. But there may be at the same time indirect effects, for instance, on political legitimacy, on migration, and other intermediary factors. These will often intersect to have consequences that may be synergistic or cascading, to use some of the terminology that is currently used in, for instance, the IPCC reports. So therefore, when we try to understand this in quantitative terms, we have to be aware that measurable effects may not be so easily associated with just the climatic change, just with, say, a year of warmer temperature or a year of greater drought, but they may also be associated with intermediary factors. They may appear significantly after the initial onset of a climatic change or disaster. And we may also see effects that are as strong or stronger in adjacent regions, and not only where the climatic change is most pronounced. Second, however, the cascading effects are not necessarily each unique, each sui generis. There are complex but also recurring causal pathways that we do tend to see in contemporary cases of climate-induced or climate-triggered conflict. This model here was presented by one of the colleagues in the project from SIPRI, that is the Stockholm International Peace and Research Institute, and its Climate and Risk Program. And it's a bit of a complex model here, but the key finding here is that we can often understand these complex links between climate and conflict in terms of four common pathways. That is to say, a feedback between climatic change, conflict, and livelihood deterioration, the first of these. For instance, there may be populations that are already vulnerable due to socioeconomic circumstances. Then these are aggravated by a climatic change, which leads to an increase in intergroup violence, political violence, which in turn aggravates livelihood conditions more. Sometimes the effects occur through population displacement and migration, which itself is subject to a variety of complex and contingent links and feedbacks. And in many cases, it seems, it's not that climate pushes people into conflict, but rather that latent conflicts occur during climate change because they can be exploited by one or another party. This may be a case, for instance, of tactical opportunities. If two groups that are already in conflict, whether we refer to two states or two populations within a state, are already in a potentially conflictual relationship, if one is impacted more by climate change than the other, this may be seen as an opportunity to initiate or to accelerate violence. And there's also possibilities of political exploitation. Political violence may occur when a regime seems weak in the wake of a disaster, for instance, or on the contrary, when in order to repress dissent, an authoritarian regime initiates violence against its own citizens in the wake of a disaster. So these are just illustrations in vague terms of some of these larger causal pathways. Now, with these two in mind, we can now return to our earlier questions. First of all, can the new historical data that we are gathering actually identify these kinds of causal pathways, in particular, these kinds of indirect, displaced, and delayed effects that we see in the contemporary data? Because that would help us understand whether or not there really are recurring climate-related conflicts throughout history identifiable in our historical data. Now, I won't have time to get through all of this data, and I imagine this has been something that has been discussed in other lectures here. But I will say that we are getting better data both for climate and for society. In terms of past climate, we have more high-resolution paleoclimatology. In other words, if we think about the kinds of physical sources, the kinds of natural sources that might give us climatic information, variations in isotopes and ice cores, for instance, or studies of tree rings based on their width or tree ring cell density. Those have become considerably more abundant, and especially more abundant are those studies that provide data year by year and not simply decade by decade. We have more information as well from historical climatology, from the work of carefully gathering written evidence and trying to convert this into quantitative measurements of key climate variables, such as seasonal temperature or precipitation. And much of this information now is being put together with the aid of computer models in reanalyses. And I would point particularly to the excellent work of Stefan Brönnemann at the University of Bern and his student Angela Maria Bergdorf, who has put together a large documentary database for which we can start to use this high-resolution information. In terms of climate, disaster, and conflict databases, there are excellent new examples of trying to unify and standardize historical information. I would point to the HISCO database of Nicolas Mohan at Aix-Marseille, who was a collaborator on this project, and particularly to the work that has been done in digitizing and mapping the vast historical records of Imperial China. This includes the research and databases of our colleague Elaine Lin in this project, including the so-called REACHES database and SEER database, which have started to accumulate the many tens of thousands of records of local disasters, weather observations, and observations of conflict in Imperial China. The quantitative analysis as well has become more sophisticated, including more techniques in nonlinear statistical analysis, more spatial analysis, putting this into maps to see spatial relationships, as well as other approaches, including Bayesian approaches, which can overcome some of those basic problems of selection bias and autocorrelation. Now, to move from these more theoretical discussion to some examples, let me look here at our example from China in 1776 to 1851, drawing on data from those REACHES and SEER databases. This was a period that we know of crisis in late Imperial China, corresponds to the White Lotus rebellions and then the Taiping rebellion. It's also a period, however, for which we have quite abundant historical records, which are now contained in these databases. Now, if I simply give you the kind of charts of linear information about, say, grain stocks, famine, epidemic, warfare, and so forth, or climatic variables such as drought and flood, as you can see, it is terribly confusing. There is a great deal there. And there are obviously many possible associations we might draw if we don't have in mind how these looked spatially at a more local, more regional level in China, as well, and also if we don't have in mind what kinds of connections, what kinds of patterns to expect between climate and conflict. If we were to simply run a variety of linear correlation analyses, we would certainly find something, but whether that something was significant would still be up in the air. It's also a question, too, of what scale we look at. So, putting together some of the new data and trying to draw on some of the ideas raised by contemporary climate and conflict analysis, we might get a better idea of what connections were really occurring and how they relate to our present-day concerns. Now, this is still, I admit, quite complex, but what you are seeing here at the top left is an association between areas of major drought and areas of major epidemics during this period. And as you can see here, the worst of the drought that China experienced during this period was largely focused on the, the central eastern China there, particularly populated regions near the mouth of the Yangtze River, as well as parts of northern China above the Yellow River, where there was also a significant outbreak of epidemics. This is particularly the case in more central China. Now, what you are seeing in the bottom right is an association between population growth and the number of significant outbreaks of intergroup violence. And you see these are correlated rather differently. They're correlated largely in western China and southwestern China, in the upper reaches of the Yangtze River, as well as other areas of settlement in the hills of southwestern China. And there is actually a story here that this data helps us understand, this more detailed spatial data, in a way that sometimes the linear projections over timelines do not. What we're seeing here is a pattern that might actually be one to be expected based on our contemporary knowledge, based on our contemporary observations of climate and conflict. Namely, that where there was already historically a denser population and major climatic crisis related to drought, where there was food riots, high prices, here we see epidemics, and we also see substantial population displacement, outmigration to areas of settlement where population had been lower, but where it was growing more quickly. And it's in those areas where new settlers are being displaced in more western, southwestern China, upper reaches of the Yangtze Valley in the hills, that we're seeing the outbreaks of conflicts. So it's the population displacement which is also producing a delayed and displaced impact on conflict. Now, to take a more qualitative example here, we can ask ourselves whether we're seeing the same kinds of complex and recurring pathways in contemporary historical examples. This will give us a better sense then of whether our historical qualitative work is really telling us something about broader relationships between climate and conflict and their relationship to the present day. Here I'll take another case study built for this project. This is in Catalonia from the late 16th to early 17th centuries. This is a period where there was both extreme droughts, particularly during the 1580s and 1590s, followed by extreme flooding, with a particularly prominent example in 1617. The destruction caused by that flood in Catalonia is illustrated in the bottom map. Now, one interesting aside here is on how some of the drought reconstructions were done. Some of the best reconstruction material we have is actually based on the frequency of so-called rogation ceremonies, of prayers for rain organized by the cathedrals of Catalonia, which correlate very well, as we know, with summers of exceptional drought that threatened crops. Now, this period also brought multiple overlapping types of conflict to Catalonia in particular. What were these? Well, first of all, and most directly, we can see cases where drought or flooding was followed by poor harvests, high prices, and in some cases, because of larger climatic patterns of the Little Ice Age of this period, restrictions in grain imports. This led to bread riots, which I believe peaked around 1630. And we can see these in part in the same terms of livelihood deterioration that was discussed as one of the complex recurring pathways in the contemporary studies. But there are other simultaneous conflicts, interacting conflicts going on at the same time. Particularly during the worst periods of drought, there was aggravated political conflict between the municipal government of Barcelona and the cathedral chapter, the representative of the Catholic Church in the city at the same time. Conflicts largely over who would get to control water supplies in the city. And this seems to be a case where the threat to urban water supplies created by the recurring droughts of this period was taken advantage of by the municipal government to try to freeze out church control of water supply and the presence of the church in city government, which at first was simply a political dispute, but actually did spiral in some cases into actual violence between representatives of those two groups, which we may see as one of these instances of tactical exploitation, as discussed, one of these complex recurring pathways. Now finally, and perhaps most interestingly, this was also a period for which we have excellent data on the number of witch hunts. This has been quite a controversial subject in the study of climate and conflict. It was raised in an article, I believe more than 20 years ago, that there was a apparent statistical correlation in Central Europe, it was first discovered, between the frequency of cold, wet summers and the frequency of prosecutions for witchcraft, particularly during the late 16th and 17th centuries. Now, this has obviously been disputed because no one would like the explanation that the whole phenomenon of witch hunts was due to climate or due to the Little Ice Age, given, of course, that there are complex social factors, cultural factors involved, and also due to the fact that not every country sees the same connection. However, within the context of Catalonia during this period, we may not be able to say that witch hunts were due to the Little Ice Age, but perhaps we can say that certain peaks in the number of prosecutions were due to the Little Ice Age type climate. If it's not a question of why this occurred, it may be a question at least of timing. Moreover, we can see in the records of those witch trials that disasters and weather magic were frequently cited as reasons for the prosecution of women during these witch trials. And it was overwhelmingly women in more marginalized circumstances who were victimized. There's definitely a strong social and cultural element here. So to some extent, too, this also represents an apparent instance, one of these pathways, of exploiting conflict in order for groups to attack those who are more marginalized. In any case, it's a way of trying to understand these historical examples in terms of the contemporary patterns that social science has helped to identify. So summing up here, if we try to think about then what history may contribute to the larger discussion, we can see that there are apparent continuities between past and present here. We see in many cases the same type of complex effects, and if we know what to look for, we do find that they do recur in some cases in the historical record. And we do tend to see many of the same causal pathways and patterns. That said, I would not want to suggest that there were only similarities between past and present, or that all we can do in history is look for the same types of patterns, the same type of connections that the social science is providing for us today. There may, of course, be different and overlooked patterns, especially if we look over the longer term. Another feature of historical examples that came up in our discussions in this project, that came up in our conversations at the workshop in Oslo, is the prevalence, for instance, of so-called slow violence in the Little Ice Age and in other times of climatic change. This idea of slow violence, raised by the sociologist Rob Nixon, refers to less spectacular forms of violence, particularly by the powerful against the weak or the poor, largely by, for instance, withholding means of adaptation during times of stressful transition or climatic change. So we know, for instance, that there were cases when the powerful would withhold access to common lands or withhold other ways of trying to cope through, say, cold Little Ice Age winters. And this idea has been raised in the excellent forthcoming work of Zozan Petlivan as a way of understanding, for instance, conflicts in eastern Anatolia during the late Ottoman Empire, as pastoralists were often withheld the same kinds of means of adaptation, of recovery, during cold winters, during famines of the late 19th century in Kurdistan. Finally, it raised the question of how we might use history to better communicate to the present. Whether there are, as it were, lieux de mémoire that we can find within the historical record that would help us to draw on this historical experience. And in fact, in the example I gave you from Catalonia, much of the work built on a peculiar historical record known as the Book of Fountains, created by the town council, recording ways in which the city managed these droughts and floods during this period. And this record was so interesting, it actually became the subject of a forthcoming exhibition at the town archives, a public exhibition to try to connect this memory of the past, connect this experience of crisis to contemporary concerns over drought in Catalonia today, which are becoming worse decade by decade. So to bring up some preliminary conclusions then, first of all, I would say that our work in trying to bridge past and present has raised the issue of how we can better use better understand climate conflict links throughout history and today. What I think has come up most, and I'm here mostly stating my own interpretation, is that there are both risks of overstating and understating the links. We risk overstating them if we only look for, if we imagine, I should say, that there is always a direct and immediate consequence. If we focus on the kinds of studies that would say, whether an increase in conflict immediately follows from a change in climate, or if we assume that climatic change will lead to an ever-increasing number of conflicts in the world. However, we risk understating the connections if we don't consider all the ways in which climate change, past and present, has complex effects on the occurrence of climate change. If we look only for increasing numbers of conflict globally, and if we don't consider the ways in which the timing of conflict, the nature of conflict, the pathways of conflict will change in a warming world. Second, I think there is more opportunity here for dialogue between past and present research on impacts of environmental change and climate change in particular. This same could be done, I think, with more collaboration in fields such as historical epidemiology and contemporary epidemiology, as well as in migration studies. And if we do so, I think we can move beyond, perhaps, simply rough analogies between past and present, between sort of open-ended lessons from history, and think about ways in which history might be used more immediately, more practically, and we can really see these connections between past and present. In other words, thinking about history in this case, not simply as a distant or distorted mirror of our present-day global warming challenges, but rather thinking of our present challenges as just one more chapter in a longer story, whose ending, of course, has not been written. So with that, I'll go ahead and wrap up. Thank you again for coming.